Hi everyone, this is this week's lecture, What is Racism, Parts 1 and 2. Um, in this week's reading, you've had to focus on a number of different things, but first and foremost, you had the Takaki reading, which actually asked you to really kind of look at the ways in which we study groups in comparison to one another or in relationship to one another, and to really question how we've thought about race as it relates to history. You are also asked to listen to a very sort of important lecture on redlining practices here in Sacramento and trying to understand why people live where they live here in Sacramento. And so make sure you really kind of understand those central issues as it relates to the formation of our neighborhoods, where we live, and what's going on in Sacramento proper. As we get into racism, I think it's important for us to actually have some baseline definitions, and that's what this particular lecture focuses on is racism and multiple different levels, and the different ways in which we approach the study of it. So first and foremost, racism refers to a variety of individual and institutional practices, beliefs, social relations, and phenomena that work to reproduce a racial hierarchy and social structure that yields superiority and privilege for some and discrimination and oppression for others. I think what's really important to understand about racism is that it purports, or at least argues, that one group is far superior based on perceived differences in skin color as compared to another group based on skin color. So you need to be able to understand that superiority and inferiority are sort of built into this definition. Just as importantly, you should be able to look at a term like racial equality and understand that unlike racism, which focuses on the acts, racial inequality concerns unequal outcomes. In other words, differences in income, differences in education, and differences in health. So, for example, when you are looking at something like the pay gap, you should be able to understand the ways in which race can play a role in terms of understanding different outcomes, right? So, why people are earning things differently, why men and women are earning something differently, or why their salaries are different. These are things that we're going to focus on as we move forward in class. Racism is both overt and covert, meaning that it can be in your face, like some of the things that we see in news, or if you think back to a lot of the film that we saw on, the civil rights movement, where people were being beat or hung or lynched, right? Those are examples of overt, in-your-face forms of racism. Or they can be covert, meaning that they're secretive, that they're practices that people don't want to talk about. It's just sort of the way that it is. Or oftentimes, when we do studies, for example, of what happens in the job market, it can be practices where people will set aside applications because someone's name sounds too, quote unquote, ethnic, right? First name or last name. That these are not things that are in your face that you can name, but they are happening and they lead to unequal outcomes. It's also important to note that racism happens in three different ways. It's individual, institutional, and it's systemic. And I'm going to go through the sort of three definitions for those. Individual racism consists of overt acts by individuals that cause death, injury, mental or physical injury, that is, destruction of property, or denial of services or opportunity. This type of racism is often considered attitudinal. In other words, it's an act or attitude that an individual has in which they try to enact that form of inequality or that sort of mindset on other people. Again, this is something that deals with sort of individualized behaviors, one-on-one behaviors, how someone acts towards someone else. It doesn't deal with some of the larger issues. It's important to note that historically, individual racism was viewed as a byproduct of individual prejudices. Prejudice is the holding of preconceived ideas about an individual or group. These are ideas that are resistant to change, even in the face of new information. So, for example, if we were only to look at, for example, the use of racial slurs, so, for example, sorry, I'm kind of stumbling here. Let's think of instead of the use of stereotypes. Is that we often hear stereotypes that all Latinos or all African Americans men are gangsters, right, or thugs. And if you were only watching TV, that on television, these are some of the stereotypes that we have. These are sort of mass generalizations that we have of people. But even when we show evidence to the contrary, that Latinos and African Americans are hard workers, that they are individuals who could be very good in school, who can be leaders of industry, that can do all sorts of other things, and people still hold on to that stereotype, right? That's a prejudice. Oftentimes, I think about prejudice as prejudgments. Prejudice, right, is something prejudgments are something that all of us have and all of us can become subject to. But when we take those prejudices and act on them, right, and we do something to prevent an individual from being able to obtain an outcome, an equal outcome, then that becomes racism. Scholars critique the idea that racism could only be attributed to an individual's actions for a few different reasons. They argued that it ignored the ways that racism permeated institutions, including education, law, politics, and banking, and that by only focusing on individuals, oftentimes we lose sight of the ways in which it's not just an individual problem. If we make it an individual problem, we just need to fix that one person, as opposed to understanding the way in which these racialized attitudes have worked their way into things like the educational system, economics, labor markets, that we have laws that were put into place that did not treat people equally. For example, Jim Crow laws, which we'll talk about a little later, which were laws in the South that prevented African Americans from being able to go to particular schools, being able to go to particular colleges, being able to sit in particular types of the buses. All of those things, right, had very different outcomes. And even if you had gotten rid of an individual who was acting out, right, on that racism, you wouldn't get rid of the problem of racism. And so therein lies a critique, is that you need to go beyond just the individual. Discrimination is behavior that denies to the members of a particular group resources or rewards that can be obtained by others. Discrimination must be distinguished from prejudice. Individuals who are prejudiced or have prejudgments against others may not necessarily engage in discriminatory practices against them. In other words, someone may prejudge someone as being lazy or being lesser than. They could think that they were promiscuous, right? As you'll read about in another in the article, "We Don't Sleep Around Like White Girls Do." They could have prejudgments about someone's abilities to work, but if they don't act on it, right, then it's not discrimination. If they don't try to prevent somebody from trying to obtain something, then it's not discrimination, right? In other words, people can have these thoughts, but do they act on them? When we actually act on those thoughts, then it becomes discrimination. It's important to be able to distinguish between a couple of different types of discrimination. We have de facto discrimination and de jure discrimination. De facto discrimination is discrimination in practice, but not necessarily ordained by law. It can be discrimination based on a person's race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, etc., and it's faced by that person or group in the daily conduct of everyday life in a particular society that is not supported or mandated by laws. So these can be racial epithets or comments. Sexual harassment in the workplace is an example of like de facto discrimination. In other words, people can make remarks about women, right? But this isn't necessarily ordained in law, saying that you are allowed to do this in law. That there isn't a law that allows people to say discriminatory things against women. As we noted, there's 3 different levels of racism. One of the other levels is institutional racism. These are more subtle but no less destructive. This involves policies, practices, and procedures of institutions that give a disproportionately negative effect on that have a disproportionately negative effect on racial minorities' access to and quality of goods, services, and opportunities. In other words, that there are practices and procedures and policies in place that prevent equal outcomes. And that really, when you look at the second half of this class, it really focuses on these different policies and practices. So oftentimes, the types of, when we have racism based in policies and practices, this is called a form of de jure discrimination. And for me, I remember jurors looks like jury, so therefore it's in law. De jure discrimination is enforced legally by legislation and refers to the racial segregation imposed by the state. So, for example, historically, as I've noted, we had Jim Crow laws. These laws, written into inequality and racism, was actually written into the laws, saying that African Americans could not ride a bus, a particular part of the bus, they couldn't attend particular schools, that they had to drink out of particular water fountains. Similar laws that existed here in California were things like the Q laws in San Francisco that also legislated what Chinese were allowed to do in the 1840s and 1850s, that they couldn't have more than X number of people living in a house, that they had to cut off their queues, which were those sort of long braids that had religious implications to it. They weren't allowed to eat particular foods. So when that discrimination is written into the law, when that inequality is written into the law, then it's de jure discrimination. Some other contemporary examples are California Proposition 187, which was sort of an anti-immigration law here in the state of California, or more recently, Arizona and Georgia immigration laws empowered their police to pull people over on suspicion of being illegal. Quote unquote, suspicion of being illegal and leaving that at the discretion of the police basically meant that they could pull people over for driving while being brown, right? That this had very specific racial implications that targeted a very specific group of people. The other type of de jure discrimination that you're going to learn a lot about in the reading for this week is redlining. This is the practice of marking a red line on a map to delineate the area where banks would not invest. So this particular picture is a historic example of Philadelphia. And the areas marked in red were areas where banks would not lend money, or would only lend money if you were a racial minority. They would deny services either directly or through selectively raising prices to residents of certain areas based on the racial or ethnic makeups of those areas. So you should be able to talk about why this is institutional racism. And just as importantly, know that redlining is something that happened in Sacramento. And so as you're going through and listening to the lecture on Sacramento, you should understand, how is it that Oak Park, for example, was historically African American? Or how is it that Land Park, which is right next to Sacramento City College, was predominantly white? What were some of the laws in place that didn't allow, that led to institutional forms of racism? Again, we've already talked about Jim Crow laws, so I'm going to skip through this, but know that to further add on to the Jim Crow discussion is that keeping in mind that you also had Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a court case that ruled that separate but equal was okay. That as long as you had equal accommodations, then therefore you could keep people separate based on race. You should also be able to tell me why this is institutional racism. Finally, kind of going back to Omi and Wanat, which you read last week, they talked a lot about racial projects and the social construction of race. And basically, Omi and Wanat argued that a racial project can be defined as racist if and only if it creates or reproduces structures of domination based on essential categories of race. So part of what they argued is that if the definition, or if the particular issue that you're looking at creates a system in which one group is superior and the other one is inferior, and that you disseminate resources unequally based on that particular idea, then it in fact is racist. And then the third and final sort of area that we talk about in this particular lecture is the idea of systemic racism. Systemic racism is the basis of individual and institutional racism. It is the value system that is embedded in a society that supports and allows discrimination. So in other words, we know that we have individual racism, which is how an individual behaves. We have institutional, which is ways in which racism, or that inferiority and superiority, is built into laws. But when we talk about systemic racism, we're really talking about a culture which is perpetuated through every part of what we do, whether that's the education system, whether that is through everyday interactions, in which we perpetuate a belief that a particular group, because of their race, is less deserving of equal treatment, that we allow particular ideas to go unchecked or unquestioned. So, one of the examples I give, and I think that the Takaki reading does a very good job of this, is, is that when we think about our history books, we tell history a very specific way. When we select what we're teaching our students on a day-to-day basis, we've historically chosen textbooks that do not give an equal telling of history and the contributions of different minority groups to the development of the United States. And so often it is really easy to go through your entire life and never learn about the contributions that African Americans or Latinos or Asians or Native Americans have made to the agricultural industry of California, to understand how the work of the country and the development of our industries was done through the contributions of individuals from immigrant groups or was forced through slavery. And that this has continued to be perpetuated, for example, when in textbooks, for example, if you've read up on the latest sort of news that's been going on, we also know that in states like California and Texas, we have groups of people who've been advocating that we should use a textbook that calls slavery immigration, ignoring the fact that people were stolen from their lands, forced to work, and were not given any compensation, were treated violently and killed, right? So when we retell history in such a way that it makes invisible the violence and the sacrifice and the truth, that lends itself to a culture that treats one group as subordinate and another group as superior. And that is a form of systemic racism. As you go through the readings for this week, I want you to kind of think about all of these different terms, which I know I've thrown a lot at you in the 15 minutes here. But I want you to go through these different terms and be able to apply very specific questions or ideas, right, from the readings to each of these terms.